Alright guys, the next property which we can define for the grid container are grid auto columns, grid auto rows and grid auto flow. To understand these three properties, here we have, let's start from the beginning again. So we will have only 6 items. We'll understand them soon. And again, get back to normal. Save this. We have just display grid and 6 items inside the container. Give it a refresh. Okay, each and every item is by default is a block level element, so that's why they are starting from a new line. Perfect. Now let's create few columns and rows. So first of all, we will create columns. So the property is grid template columns. We have already understood how we can create columns and rows. So here let's define a repeat function. Let's say we need 3 columns. 3. Each column is having width of 200 pixel. Now save this, give it a refresh. Okay, so here we have 6 items and each and every items has been assigned in individual columns inside this grid system. First column, second column and third column. One thing here I would like to mention that we have created 3 columns. Perfect. Then the fourth item where it should be going automatically. We have just created 3 columns here. So this grid system is saying that I got the space only for 3 items. That means I can have just 3 columns inside the system. So I cannot afford another column because it has not been created. So by default, where the other items will go, where the next item will go, where the next item will start from. So if any item does not get space inside the system, it automatically starts from the new row. So that's why after the third column, next item is starting from the next row. Although here we haven't created any rows, but by default inside a grid system, if the item does not find space or explicit space inside the system, it will automatically start from the next row. That's why here we are seeing. Yeah, so here is the concept of implicit and explicit. What is implicit and what is explicit inside the grid system? The explicit means whatever the things we have created actually inside the system. That means here we have created explicitly 3 columns. On each column is having width of 200 pixels. This has been defined by us inside the container. Okay, and the things which we haven't created, for example, the row, first row, even the second row, we haven't created any rows, but still we are seeing that, still we are getting those rows. So these rows are known as implicit. Implicit will generate automatically or by default. If you haven't defined anything, then also you will see the implicit items. So the rows are implicit items, implicit component you can say actually. So the explicit and implicit, explicit you will have to define yourself. Okay, and implicit it will get generated automatically. So again here, that why the third column, why the fourth item is starting from the next rows. That's the implicit thing. Perfect. So but if we define any rows, say grid template rows, repeat maybe 200 pixel or let's say 300 pixel actually. Okay, it would be enough, large enough. So we'll say just 200, repeat to 200 pixel. So we have 2 columns now which has been explicitly defined and having the height of 200 pixel. Yeah, that's the explicit rows. Now we'll get back to again implicit things. Give it a refresh. Yeah, we don't have any rows now. Now there is another property that is known as grid auto column and grid auto rows. First of all, we will have a look of grid auto rows. Grid auto rows, we have a property grid. Here we have auto rows. So grid auto rows is saying whatever the implicit rows are there. So how you can style those, how we can provide some width and height, or how much height of those implicit item will be. So the grid auto rows, let's define say 100 pixel. Yeah, whatever the implicit row will be there, each and every implicit rows will be having height of 100 pixel. Let's give it a refresh. You can see these are the implicit rows we haven't created, so that's why it is getting the height of 100 pixel from this property grid auto rows. We can also define say 300, give it a refresh. So these rows are having a height of 300 pixel. Those are known as grid auto rows. Next property we have grid auto columns. Grid auto columns, similar to the grid template rows, we have grid template, sorry, not out template, it is grid auto rows. Similar to the grid auto rows, we can also define grid auto columns. So let's define the width of grid auto columns, say 400 pixel. Yeah, save this, give it a refresh. We don't see any changes, we don't have any auto columns because we have explicitly defined 3 columns, and after that we don't have 4th column, though we don't have any auto columns. So that's why we don't have any changes, just because we have defined grid auto columns. But there is another property after this that is known as grid auto flow. Yeah, grid auto flow. So the grid auto flow, the grid auto flow property, what it does, it will actually define the direction of the items, define the direction of the extra items, where the extra item will sit, whether it will go into the next row or it will sit in the next column only. So that's why here we have grid auto flow. By default, the grid auto flow property is the value of that is row. So let's define row here, save this, you won't find any changes. Yeah, because by default it is on the row only, grid auto flow. If we say grid auto flow column now, so whatever the extra item will be after the 3rd column, those extra item will again come into the next column only. Let's give it a refresh. Okay, here we can see. Yeah, so here we have 1 2 3 4th row, sorry, 4th column. This is the auto column actually, because we have seen the grid auto flow column. So this is the these are the auto column, and for each and every auto column we are having the width of 400 pixel. Yeah, that's why here we are seeing. So these are the things. First of all, we have implicit and explicit. Explicit, whatever the things you want explicitly, then define that, that is grid template columns. And then we have grid auto rows. The grid auto rows, what it does, whatever the auto rows will be generated, it will provide the height for those automatically created rows. And then similarly we have grid auto columns. So the grid auto columns will provide the width to the auto columns, and grid auto flow will change the direction of the items, whether the item will sit on the next row, that is extra items, that is implicit items, will sit on the next row or next column. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, okay, let's get back to normal, to the grid auto flow row only. Give it a refresh. Yeah,